Hello, this is Dennis Blewett again. I hope everybody is doing well today. Now, I am not doing well. Every day I get angrier and angrier, and I'm not in a position to express it to really anybody who would understand. But maybe it's because I'm getting old, or maybe it's because some people are getting more and more stupid. But I look at the way things were almost 50 years ago when I started practicing law, and the way they are now today is very, very depressing. I almost feel like my legal career has been for nothing. When I was in law school, the Vietnam War was going on. So politics were a prime discussion then, both pro and against the war. And law school in Chicago was more particularly divided, because Mayor Daley was there. But also were a lot of other people, like Hans Morgenthau and his Committee of 1,000, and a few of these people. But when I started practicing in Colorado, I had a client, it was sort of a volunteer job, as counsel for the Head Start program here, the Office of Economic Opportunity. That was a project of Lyndon Johnson. Curiously enough, I got the appointment to that by a Republican senator named Peter Dominick. But anyway, went to these meetings, and then Bobby Kennedy got assassinated, and a lot of other violence. There were riots. The Chicago Democratic Convention turned into mayhem. Excuse me. And listening to the rhetoric of the Republicans, many of us knew we had to prepare for some really radical changes, which we did. At the same time, there was a push by police lobby, district attorneys and police sheriffs, etc., to roll back the search and seizure rules. This seemed to be a hot topic with the police. They came up with propagandist ideas like, why should we bust our asses catching criminals when the courts turn around and let them out? Well, my feeling there is you have that attitude, surrender your badge, because your prime obligation is to support the Constitution. And the Constitution is very specific about the presumption of innocence and also specific about the right to bail. And just because you might think somebody's guilty doesn't necessarily mean that's the case. You can't act both as judge and jury. So, if you spend your time as a policeman chasing an offender and you arrest him and he makes bail, tough. Your job is to enforce the law. You're not a security guard for the community. Now, when I first started practicing, most people were admitted to bail. I remember I could go in and visit a client in the jail within a half an hour of his arrest, generally get a bond set, call a bondsman, and he'd be released 2 or 3 hours later. Now there's no way to get a client out of jail until he spends the night there, just about. A big change, and that came with Bail Reform Act. But it really wasn't a bail reform. The legislators and the politicians pulled the wool over our eyes, and they entitled the amendment as an amendment to abolish obsolete language in the Constitution. So I guess right to bail was obsolete language. I mean, it dates clear back to Magna Carta, which is 1000, so I imagine it probably is, by definition, at least ancient, but I doubt seriously if it's obsolete. Anyway, the judges jumped on that because most of them had never had clients. Their client was the district attorney's office, and they viewed the police as their clients rather than citizenry in general. So they would talk to the clients, they got to know talk to the police, they got to know the police, and they became friends with the police, and they interacted with the police. That was their whole circle of friends. And every time they would listen to the police complain about Knapp versus Ohio was the name of the case there, which applied federal guidelines to the states on searches and seizures. Now, when I was in law school, one of the lawyers I eventually tried a case with did a case called Escobedo versus Illinois. Danny Escobedo was a petty criminal. He was arrested. Warren Wilson was his lawyer. Warren was going to the jail to visit another client and saw that Danny was there. Danny requested to see Mr. Wilson, and the officer said, well, later, when we're done with you. And they didn't tell Warren that Danny wanted to see him. So as soon as Escobedo confessed, then they let him see Warren or whatever he was up to. And that was the end of it. However, with the confession, they prosecuted. The Escobedo case proceeded through the courts and finally ended up with the Supreme Court ruling saying that, essentially holding that the right to counsel under the Sixth Amendment is an absolute rule, and it can't be circumvented by the will of the police. So we had a judiciary at that point that was actively advocating and watching out for the creeping influence of a police state, but it still crept on. The next one was the Miranda case, which I tried with John Flynn, who did that case in Arizona. I tried a case with him in Denver here. He's a really great lawyer. Anyway, Miranda also, that case said you had to advise people that they have certain rights, right to counsel, right to trial by jury, etc. Before that, even though the police knew that they couldn't violate rights, at least under Escobedo, they were being coy about it and decided if the defendants or the arrestees don't know about it, why the hell should we tell them? So that's the way they operated for quite a while. Well, one of the things that happened after I started was the election of Richard Nixon. Now, I mentioned earlier that I was attorney for the Head Start program. We figured there would be a cut in budget, so we did emergency appropriations so we had money for the next year. But our program on the drug abuse that I worked for, that I was appointed to by Dominic, was funded out of the HEW budget. When Nixon got elected, he impounded our funds and hired a person who had been our executive director and formed a brand new agency called Law Enforcement Assistance Agency. And with the stroke of a pen, the idea of treating addiction or drugs as a medical problem and as a social problem all of a sudden became a law enforcement problem. which sent us back as a civilization for several hundred years. So from now on, I'll be addressing some of the problems there that I've seen over the last 40 years. But that's about it for today. Bye.